The contract arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Sarah Calloway had designated, sometime around the third month of barely surviving, as the universe's preferred day for delivering bad news. The envelope was slid under her apartment door sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, which she knew because she'd been awake at 2. Staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been growing incrementally since October, and asleep by 3 in the fitful, disconnected way of people whose bodies had given up on proper rest, but hadn't yet given up entirely. She found it when she went to make coffee, barefoot on cold hardwood, still wearing yesterday's clothes, because changing had seemed like an ambition the previous evening had been unable to support. Her name was on the envelope in ink so dark, it absorbed the morning light rather than reflecting it. Sarah Calloway. No return address. No postage. The handwriting was the kind that had been formed before typing existed, each letter deliberate and permanent, as if the person who'd written it had been taught that words put to paper were a form of commitment. The paper inside was heavy and cream-colored, and had no business being inside an envelope slid under the door of a woman who was 11 days from eviction. The letter was brief. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, with her coffee going cold beside her, reading it 3 times because the first 2 times her brain kept stalling at the part that couldn't be real. The offer was this: 1 month, 30 days of her time, her presence, her name on a marriage certificate. In exchange, all debts cleared. The eviction notice dissolved, her sister's medical treatment funded completely. Not the minimum, the full course, the kind that actually worked. $50,000 in addition, transferred on day 1 as a gesture of good faith. The marriage would be annulled on day 31. No contact required after. The word willing was used twice, which she noticed because legal language didn't repeat itself unless repetition was load-bearing. At the bottom, a name. Damon Voss. And a number. She put the letter down, picked up her coffee, which was cold, drank it anyway, because throwing away coffee was a habit she'd lost when money became something she counted rather than spent. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling. She thought about her sister Leah in a hospital bed, in the specific position of someone who has made peace with being in a hospital bed, the terrible efficiency of adapting to something that shouldn't be survivable. She thought about 11 days. She called the number. The voice that answered was low and even, with an accent that was precisely unplaceable, carrying traces of too many places to belong conclusively to any of them. He'd been expecting her call, not in the way people said that to seem prepared in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom the outcome had been a reasonable probability rather than a surprise. She had one question before she'd consider anything else. Why her? A pause that wasn't hesitation, more like the pause of someone deciding how much truth was operationally useful. Your name was given to me by someone who knew you when you were different from what your current circumstances suggest. Someone who thought your specific qualities were relevant to my specific requirements. She didn't ask who. She asked what qualities. Clarity, he said. Steadiness under pressure. The ability to function in situations that would compromise someone less grounded. He paused. Also a particular kind of integrity that doesn't perform itself. That simply exists. She looked at the eviction notice on her kitchen table, the letter from the hospital about Leah's next round, the stack of other envelopes she'd stopped opening because the information inside them had stopped being new. Tell me what 30 days actually means, she said. He told her. His household required the appearance of a committed relationship for a specific period related to a family obligation he didn't elaborate on. Her presence at several formal events, shared living arrangements, a suite of her own, her privacy completely maintained. After 30 days, the arrangement concluded. The annulment was already drafted. She'd never hear from him again, unless she chose otherwise. She stood in her kitchen on the cold hardwood floor in yesterday's clothes, and made the decision that people made when the options had narrowed to the point where only one of them faced forward. "Fine," she said. 1 month. The car arrived the next morning. The apartment she was moved into was in a building that seemed to have opinions about the concept of luxury, the kind that whispered rather than shouted, marble and proportion, and the specific hush of spaces where sound was managed rather than simply absent. The suite she was given had 3 rooms, which was 2 more than her entire previous apartment, and a window that looked over the city from a height that made the city look like a different city, the one that existed in the imagination of people who'd never had to count it. He was there when she arrived, standing in the main room with the particular quality of someone who occupied space differently from most people, more deliberately, as if every position he took in a room was chosen rather than defaulted to. He was tall, the kind of tall that reorganized a room's geometry, and his face was the kind of face that painters had once been interested in, all clear angles and the specific shadows of strong bone structure. His eyes were dark, nearly black, and held the quality of depth that accumulated across time she didn't have a measurement for. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she read immediately as assessment that had already completed itself and moved on to something less legible. Then, he said her name. Sarah, not Miss Calloway, not a title of any professional kind, just her name, in the voice that had been low and even on the phone, and was the same in person. A voice that had decided long ago it didn't need volume to be heard. She looked back at him with the steadiness she'd developed across months of bad news arriving in official envelopes. The steadiness of someone who had learned that fear was information and panic was its misinterpretation. "So," she said, 30 days. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the negative space of one, the place a smile might occupy if it decided to. 30 days, he confirmed. The first event is tomorrow evening. Sable will explain what that requires. He indicated a woman who had appeared in the doorway, dark-haired and efficient, who had the manner of someone who had arranged impossible things so many times that the impossible was simply the category of things she handled. Sable explained. The formal events, the social geography of who mattered in whatever world Damon Voss inhabited and why, the things Sarah should know, and the things she should not appear to know. She explained with the clinical precision of someone briefing an operative, which made Sarah feel simultaneously like a professional and like a piece being positioned on a board she couldn't see the full dimensions of. She listened to everything, asked the questions that needed asking, took the notes that were useful, and committed the rest to the particular memory she'd developed, the one that retained structure and pattern even when details blurred. That night, in the 3-room suite that was more space than she'd had in a year, she lay on a bed that had never known a bad night's sleep and stared at a ceiling that had no water stains and thought about 30 days the way she thought about every defined period, as a container with a beginning and an end, survivable by virtue of being finite. 30 days. She could do 30 days. She had done harder things than living in luxury, next to a strange and unsettling man for 30 days. She'd held her sister's hand through a diagnosis. She'd sat in the offices of people whose job was to tell her how much everything cost. She'd learned to open envelopes she didn't want to open, and to keep her face arranged while doing it. This was easier than all of that. This was just 30 days. She closed her eyes and meant it when she thought it, and the fact that she meant it was the last honest thing she held on to before sleep arrived, and the 30 days began. The first event was a dinner at a venue that seemed to have been built specifically to make people understand the distance between themselves and the people who ate there: regular crystal and dark wood, and the specific acoustics of a room where money was so established it had become atmospheric, present in the air the way humidity was present, affecting everything, noticed most by those who'd arrived from somewhere drier. Sarah wore what Sable had selected, a deep wine-red dress that was elegant in the specific way of things that didn't and she wore it the way she wore most things, like it was simply what she'd put on, and not a costume, which was rarer than it sounded in rooms like this one. Damon arrived at her suite at 7 precisely, knocked rather than announced himself through Sable, which she noticed, and when she opened the door he looked at her for exactly 1 moment, with an expression that had something in it she didn't have time to read, before it reorganized into the neutral composure he seemed to maintain as a default. They arrived at the dinner, and the room adjusted to his arrival in the way rooms adjusted to people who had occupied a certain kind of authority long enough that spaces responded to them the way weather responded to pressure systems. Eyes moved toward him without appearing to move. Conversations redistributed themselves. The particular social choreography of powerful people acknowledging more powerful people without performing the acknowledgement. She stayed at his side without crowding it, and watched the room with the attention she'd always brought to new environments, reading the dynamics and the subtext and the relationships between people that their formal behavior tried to conceal. She'd always been good at rooms, at understanding the real conversation underneath the conversation that was happening. A man approached, older, with the kind of authority that had stopped needing to prove itself so long ago it had become a natural feature. His name was Lucien Voss, and the family resemblance was in the bone structure, the same economy of movement. But where Damon's authority was contained, Lucien's spread. He looked at Sarah with the assessment of someone for whom this situation had specific stakes. "The new bride," Lucien said, in the tone of someone identifying something rather than greeting them. Damon's hand settled at the small of her back. The contact was light and completely deliberate, and she understood immediately that it was performance, which made it easier to register as information rather than sensation. "This is Sarah," Damon said. His voice carried its usual evenness with something underneath it she was beginning to learn to hear, a kind of compression. The sound of someone managing a great deal with economy. Lucien studied her. The quality of the study was the kind that was looking for weaknesses in the way of someone whose job had always involved finding them. "Where did you meet?" She answered before Damon could. "Through a mutual acquaintance," she said, with the ease of someone recounting something that was simply true, which was a skill she'd developed in professional contexts that had required discretion. He was very specific about what he needed. "I happened to meet all the requirements." Lucien looked at her for a moment. Something shifted, barely in his expression. Then, he looked at Damon. "She'll do," he said, in the way of someone meaning something larger than the words, which told her a great deal about what this dinner was actually for. When Lucien moved away, Damon's hand left her back. She felt the absence of it in the specific way of noticing something when it stops, a temperature change rather than a presence. But she filed it without interpreting it, because interpretation required data she didn't yet have. "You did well," Damon said quietly, not looking at her, looking at the room with the specific surveillance quality of someone who was always tracking more variables than the immediate conversation. "I answered a question," Sarah said. "It wasn't hard. It was true." A pause. Then something in his profile shifted. Just slightly. That quality she'd noticed at the door, the one she didn't have time to read, passed through his expression and was gone. The dinner continued. She managed it the way she managed difficult rooms, with attention and economy, saying what was useful and nothing that wasn't. She watched the interactions between Damon and the various Voss family members who appeared across the evening, reading the dynamics with the same attention she'd given the room, and by the end of the first course, she had a preliminary map of something she'd call a family that had calcified into a power structure, where warmth had been replaced by function and affection by obligation. She thought about that on the car ride home. About the specific loneliness of a life that had been entirely organized around obligation. She wasn't going to feel sorry for him. That was not what this was. This was 30 days of professional arrangement, and she was going to be professional, and then she was going to take the resources she'd been given and rebuild the life that had come apart. And she was going to do it without making the mistake of confusing proximity for connection. She was very clear about this. She was clear about this for approximately 4 more days. On the 5th day, she found him in the apartment's library at 2 a.m. She'd been unable to sleep, which was not unusual, her body still adjusting to the luxury of uninterrupted quiet after months of thin walls and street noise. The library was a room she'd claimed as hers, in the non-possessive way of someone who found rooms necessary. She'd discovered it on day 2. All dark shelves, and the particular silence of spaces full of books, and she'd started going there in the evenings, because thinking happened better for her in libraries, always had. She hadn't expected him to be there. He was in the chair by the window, with a book open in his lap, and the city lights behind him, and he looked up when she entered with the quality of someone who'd heard her coming from further away than the door, which she filed under things about him she was accumulating, without meaning to. He looked different at 2 a.m. in the library, without the formal clothes and the managed composure of the public version. More like himself, whatever that meant. More like someone whose face had a default setting that was quieter and stranger and less careful than what he showed rooms full of people. She came in anyway, because the library was her library for 30 days, and she'd paid for it in a specific way. She took the other chair, the one across the low table from his, and pulled her knees up under the oversized sweater she'd put on to move through the apartment at 2 a.m, and opened her own book, and they read in silence. The silence had a quality she hadn't expected. Not the silence of 2 strangers tolerating shared space. Something more inhabited. The silence of a room that had 2 people in it who were both actually present rather than just located there. After a while, without planning it, she looked up and found him already looking at her with an expression that reorganized itself too quickly for her to catch its full shape. The speed of the reorganization was its own information. People didn't reorganize expressions they didn't think needed managing. She went back to her book. But the silence had changed its quality, warmer and more aware of itself, and she stayed in it for another hour before going back to bed, where she fell asleep immediately and correctly, which hadn't happened in months. She didn't think about why. Day 8 introduced the complication she hadn't budgeted for. The complication was specific. It was not that Damon Voss was compelling, though he was, in the way that certain things were compelling because they contained more than was immediately visible and rewarded attention without demanding it. It was not the voice or the face or the way he occupied rooms differently from other people. All of those were observable facts she could file without consequence. The complication was that he was unexpectedly kind. Not in the performed way. Not in the way of someone executing a social protocol they'd been taught was required. In the specific and surprising way of someone who noticed things and acted on what they noticed without making the noticing into a transaction. On day 6, she'd mentioned, in passing, during a brief logistical exchange about the following evening's event, that her sister's name was Leah. Just that, her name, in the context of a sentence about the medical funding that had been part of the arrangement. He'd said nothing. On day 8, a card appeared on the desk in the library with Leah's name on it, and inside were the words that someone had taken time to find. Not a form letter, not the language of an assistant delegating compassion. Actual words chosen for an actual person in an actual situation. Get better, not because you have to, because the world is more interesting with you in it. Sarah stood at the desk and read the card 3 times, and then very carefully did not think about it too hard, because thinking about it too hard led somewhere she'd drawn a clear line about not going. On day 9, he canceled a meeting, which Sable mentioned only because it affected an evening they'd planned to attend together, and when Sarah asked what had happened, Sable said simply that he'd taken a call from her sister's hospital and had wanted to speak with the treating physician directly. To ask questions. To understand the treatment fully. Sarah sat with this piece of information for an entire afternoon. On day 10, she asked him about it. Directly, because she was the kind of person who asked direct questions about things she needed to understand. They were in the kitchen, which was the room where the formality tended to thin, because kitchens had that effect on people. The mundane business of coffee and morning light making performed distance harder to maintain. "You talked to Leah's doctor," she said. He was looking out the window at the morning city with his coffee. A pause. "Yes, why?" Another pause. The kind that was thought, rather than avoidance. "Because the information I'd received was general, and general information about someone's specific medical situation is the difference between understanding and having statistics." He turned slightly. "I prefer to understand things properly." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning light was doing something to the room that the evening light didn't, making things more visible rather than more atmospheric, and in that visibility, his expression was less managed than usual, showing the edges of something she was starting to be able to read. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No." He agreed simply. Then he went back to his coffee in the city and she went back to hers, and they stood in the same kitchen in the same morning light, and the silence between them had the same quality it had developed in the library, the kind that was company. The complication deepened across the days that followed with the specific patience of things that don't announce themselves, but accumulate. The way water found its way through stone, not by force, but by persistence. Day 12, a formal luncheon where a woman with the specific cruelty of someone who had always had resources and had mistaken this for superiority, made a remark to Sarah about the suddenness of the marriage, delivered with a smile that had no warmth behind it. Before Sarah could respond, which she would have done precisely and without rancor because she'd had sufficient practice with this type of remark, Damon answered. His voice was the same low even register it always was. But the content of what he said was the specific kind of devastating that required no volume, only accuracy. The woman smiled differently afterward, less like a weapon, more like someone who'd been reminded that other people in the room were armed. Sarah didn't thank him. But that evening in the library, she told him about a time in her previous professional life when a different type of person had made a different type of remark, and she'd handled it herself, and she watched him listen with the full attention he brought to everything she said, not waiting for his turn, but actually receiving what she offered, and she thought about how rare that was, rarer than most of the things she'd been assuming were rare. Day 15 arrived, and Sarah did the arithmetic she'd been carefully not doing, which was that they were halfway. 15 days in, 15 days remaining. The container of the arrangement was half empty, or half full depending on how you looked at it, and she found, sitting with the arithmetic, that she didn't immediately know which way she was looking. This was new information. She sat with it in the library that evening and didn't share it with anyone, which was the right decision for several reasons, primarily the one where the person she most wanted to share it with was the person it was about. The library door opened. Damon came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table beside her chair without asking if she wanted it, because he'd noticed by day 7 that she always wanted coffee in the evening and had started bringing it without ceremony. And she'd stopped noting this as significant, because noting things as significant led to the place she'd drawn a line about. She took the coffee. He sat in his chair. Outside the city did its nighttime things, and the library held them both in its particular silence, and she thought about 15 days remaining, and found that the thought had a weight she hadn't authorized it to have. "Tell me something true," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived fully formed from somewhere below the part of her that made plans. He looked at her over his cup. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of an unexpected turn in terrain he'd thought he knew the topography of. A long moment. Then, quietly, looking at the middle distance rather than at her, "I haven't sat in this room with another person in a very long time." He paused. I'd forgotten what it was like to read in the same space as someone who was also actually reading, who wasn't waiting for something from me. The room was very quiet. "Tell me something true," he said, the same register, quiet and without the pressure of expectation. She thought about what was true, the truest thing available in the specific moment. "I stopped believing, about 6 months ago, that things were going to get better." She looked at the coffee cup. Not in a dramatic way, in the quieter way of someone who'd just updated their model of the situation based on available. She paused. "I haven't updated it back yet. I keep meaning to." He looked at her with the expression that was his most honest, and that she'd been learning across 15 days, the way you learned the features of unfamiliar territory, one detail at a time, until you could navigate it. Something moved in it that she felt rather than saw. "Update it," he quietly, and without any of the hollow reassurance of someone saying what the situation required. Just update it. The way of someone who was telling her something he had reason to believe was true. She held the coffee cup and looked at him, and the library held them both, and the city moved outside the window, and 15 days remained, and she thought, "Update it." She thought, "I might." Day 17 was the day she learned what he was. She'd been in the process of not knowing, not because the information wasn't there, but because the available data hadn't yet assembled itself into an unavoidable shape. The specific pallor that was not illness, the way the morning light seemed to negotiate with him rather than land on him the way it landed on other surfaces, the temperature of his hands on the one occasion they'd briefly touched, navigating a crowded corridor at an event, his hand at her elbow steering her clear of something she hadn't yet seen, his skin cool in a specific way that wasn't cold, but wasn't warm either. The way he knew things he shouldn't know, heard things from too far away, was simply aware of his environment with a comprehensiveness that exceeded what attention alone could explain. She'd been cataloging these things, and not yet completing the catalog. On day 17, the catalog completed itself. It happened in a moment that was almost mundane. She came into the library at an hour she didn't usually, midday, to retrieve a book she'd left, and found Damon there in the daylight reading, which she'd seen before, but on this day the light fell differently, through the window at an angle that revealed rather than concealed, and what she saw was the specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a person resting, but of something that could be still in a way no person could manage, the stillness of deep water or old stone. And she stood in the doorway and her catalog completed itself in the space of one breath. She came in. She sat down. She put the book she'd come for on the table in front of her and didn't open it, and looked at him across the room. He looked back. Something in his expression was the specific stillness of someone waiting to see which direction a thing was going to go. "How old?" she said. A pause that held a great deal. Then, with the evenness he brought to most things, "Very." She nodded. Then, "Is any of it dangerous?" "For me." The quality of his stillness changed. Something moved through it, something she read as having to do with the question itself, with the fact of it. "No," he said. "Not to you. Never to you." She sat with this. The library was bright in the midday light, full of the ordinary sounds of the city outside, and she was sitting across from someone who had been alive for longer than her entire conception of history, and she felt, unexpectedly, less afraid than she'd thought she would, less afraid than she'd been sitting in the offices of the people with the envelopes, less afraid than she'd been in the hospital waiting rooms. She thought about why, and the answer was already in the room, sitting across from her with that expression, and she didn't look at the answer directly, because looking directly at things you weren't ready for accelerated timelines you hadn't finished thinking about. "Does it change things?" he asked, carefully, the question of someone who had asked a version of it before and had learned that the answer required its own space. She thought about 15 days in the apartment, about the library and the coffee, and Leah's card, and the morning kitchen, and the things said at 2 a.m. that were true, because the hour made performing easier to set down. She thought about the specific shape of the past 17 days, which had stopped feeling like a container with a clear end and started feeling like a thing with its own logic and direction. "It means I understand some things better," she said. "Why the month has the structure it has, why the old laws or the family obligations or whatever the shape of it is, require what they require." He nodded once. "It doesn't," she said, "change anything that's been true already." Another pause. Something in his expression moved through several states she couldn't fully read, landing somewhere quieter and more complex. They sat in the midday library, and outside the city moved in the ordinary way of cities, and she thought about all the things that were true, regardless of how long something had been alive to accumulate truth. She thought, the quality of the silence in this room is the same as it was yesterday and the day before, and what that means is that who he is has been consistent across 17 days. And the additional information has not changed who he has been, and that's the relevant thing. She thought, update it. She opened her book. After a moment, he opened his. The midday light shifted slowly across the library floor. Outside, ordinary life moved in its ordinary directions. Inside, 2 people read in the same room in the particular silence of people who had arrived at a new level of knowing each other and were sitting inside it quietly, getting used to the space. Day 20 brought Leah. Sarah's sister arrived in a car that Damon had arranged, because Leah's treatment had been restructured with the new funding and included a recovery period that required rest and care. And Damon had suggested, in the specific, understated way, he made suggestions that were actually generous decisions he'd already arranged. That the apartment had space, and Leah could recover better with her sister present than in a facility that was comfortable, but not a home. Leah arrived and immediately assessed every room, including Damon, with the particular evaluative attention of someone who had been through enough hard things that she no longer had patience for the surface of things, and went directly to the underneath. Leah was thinner than the last time Sarah had seen her in person, and brighter, the specific brightness of someone who had fought for something and was in the early stages of winning. She hugged Sarah in the way of sisters who have not touched each other in too long, substantive and slightly longer than necessary, and then she pulled back and looked at her face, with the accuracy of someone who had been reading this specific face since childhood. "You look different," Leah said. "Rested," Sarah said. "Good food." "That's not what I mean," Leah said. She met Damon that evening at dinner, the 3 of them at the long table in a configuration that felt both formal and unexpectedly natural. Leah was unembarrassable in the way of people who had passed through too much to care about social performance, and she asked Damon direct questions with a cheerfulness that softened them without withdrawing their substance. What do you do with yourself? What did you notice about my sister that made you certain? That last one. Sarah looked at her plate. Damon answered without hesitation. Her attention he said. Most people look at things and see their category. She looks at things and sees the specific thing they are. Leah looked at Sarah with an expression Sarah knew too. Later, when Damon had given them the specific privacy of being in a different part of the apartment, Leah sat across from Sarah on the sitting room sofa with both feet tucked under her and both hands around a mug of tea, and her expression entirely undisguised. "Sarah," she said, in the tone of someone about to say something that had been obvious to everyone except the person being addressed. "Don't," Sarah said. "I'm going to," Leah said. 10 days left. "I know," Sarah said. "And then what?" And then the arrangement concludes. Sarah kept her voice level. "As agreed." Leah looked at her with the specific accuracy of someone who had been reading her for 28 years. "Right," she said. "The arrangement." She sipped her tea. "And are you going to be fine?" "Of course," Sarah said. And the steadiness of her voice was the same steadiness she'd brought to envelopes and offices and hospital waiting rooms, but underneath it, in the place she didn't show rooms or arrangements or herself after midnight, there was something she hadn't inventoried, hadn't authorized, that was answering the question differently. Leah didn't. That was the thing about real love. It knew when to leave space. She just looked at her sister over her tea with the eyes of someone who already knew and was giving her time to catch up. 10 days, Sarah thought. The container had 10 days left. She went to sleep that night and lay in the dark and did the arithmetic she'd been refusing to do, and found that the answer was the one she'd been not finding for a while now, clear and inconvenient and present in the room with her, the way true things were present, too real to be ignored regardless of how efficiently you try. Day 23, and the formal obligation that the entire month had been arranged around, finally arrived. A gathering of the Voss family and its associated orbit, a thing that apparently happened at specific intervals and carried the weight of ritual even when it called itself a dinner. Sable prepared Sarah with more intensity than the previous events, which told her this one mattered differently. The venue was a private estate outside the city that had the quality of places that had been in a single family's possession long enough to have absorbed the family's personality rather than reflecting it, as newer wealth did. Stone and age and the specific atmosphere of somewhere that had seen a great many things and had decided opinions about most of them. Lucian Voss presided. There was no other word for what he did in a room. Other people occupied a room, even powerful people. Lucian Voss administered one. He moved through the gathering with the quality of someone taking a report, and when his eyes landed on Sarah, they did so with more attention than the previous dinner. The attention of someone who had been thinking about her since they'd last been in the same room. She held it steadily. She'd had 36 days of practice at this point, not counting the months before, and her steadiness was not performance. It was structural. "You've been here a month," Lucian said, when he arrived at her side with the timing of someone who had decided to have a specific conversation and was now having it. "Almost," she said, "and you understand what being connected to this family requires." She understood what he was actually asking, which was whether she understood what Damon was, and whether she'd be a problem about it, and whether the arrangement had been a mistake. She understood the shape of the question without the words. "I understand that some things are older than the forms they take," she said, "and that the requirements they carry were established for reasons that made sense when they were established." She met his eyes. "I understand that someone I've spent 30 days with is more than the circumstances that brought us into the same room." She paused. "And I understand that what you're actually asking me is whether I'm stable enough to know what I've been living inside." Lucian was quiet for a moment. His expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. Something that was not warmth exactly, not in a man whose personality had been built around function, but the precondition for respect, the moment before it arrived. "Are you," he said, More than I expected to be," she said honestly. He studied her for another moment. Then, "Damon has not been uncomplicated in our family's experience. He has been responsible and capable, and those things are not nothing. But uncomplicated is not a word we've applied to him." She heard the thing underneath this, the history of a long life in a complicated family, the things accumulated across time she didn't have context for. "In my experience," she said carefully, "the uncomplicated things are usually the ones that haven't been looked at closely enough." Lucian almost smiled. It was the most his face had moved toward warmth in both their encounters. He inclined his head, slightly, the gesture of someone acknowledging a point they hadn't anticipated, conceding. He moved away. Damon materialized at her side within moments. Because he'd been tracking the exchange with the comprehensive environmental awareness she'd stopped being surprised by, and he looked at her with the question she'd learned to read in his face. The one that asked without asking how she was, whether she needed anything, whether the situation required his intervention. "I'm fine," she said, before he could arrange the question into words. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression was quieter than usual, showing more of whatever lived underneath the managed composure. Then, low and only for her, "You didn't need to defend yourself to him." "I wasn't defending myself," she said. "I was having a conversation with someone who needed to have it. There's a difference." He was quiet. "Then, there is." He looked across the room at Lucian. "He's not easy to have conversations with." "Nobody worth having a conversation with is easy," she said. She felt more than saw the small shift in him, the specific change in his presence that happened when something she said landed in a way that rearranged something internal. She'd been noticing it for days, the way certain things she said or did moved through him in a visible way he didn't seem entirely aware of. 7 days, she thought. The container had 7 days. She had stopped thinking of this as the count toward a conclusion and had started thinking of it as something else. The kind of countdown that preceded a decision rather than an ending. She hadn't decided anything yet. But she was aware of the decision forming in the way you were aware of weather changing. The pressure shift before the rain arrived. The evening continued, and she moved through it with the ease she'd developed across 23 days of this life, understanding the room, reading its dynamics, finding the things worth finding. She talked to a woman named Murray, who had a quality of stillness that suggested her own history with time, who spoke about the Voss family with the measured fondness of someone who'd been adjacent to them for long enough to have real opinions. "She's different," Murray said at one point, quietly, looking across the room at Damon, who was in conversation with 2 men whose body language told a story about obligation and history. He's been alone a very long time. She paused, not without company, without someone actually looking at him. Sarah held this. She looked across the room at Damon, at the specific quality of his presence in conversation, the contained authority, and underneath it the thing she'd been learning to read, the particular aloneness of someone who had occupied the same life for so long that they'd stopped expecting it to change. She thought about the library at 2 in the morning, about the coffee appearing on the table, about a card written for a woman he'd never met because someone he barely knew had mentioned her name once. Murray was watching her look. A small sound, knowing, and not unkind. 7 days is not very long, she said. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. Day 25 brought the conversation she'd been not having with herself. She had it in the room Leah was staying in, which had become the room where they talked the way they'd talked since childhood, without the formal architecture of important conversation, horizontally, in comfortable clothes, with the specific honesty that proximity and history enabled, and that Sarah rarely allowed herself elsewhere. Leah was propped against her pillows, looking better than she had 4 days ago. the treatment doing what the better funding had made possible, and she was watching her sister sit at the foot of the bed with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a particular conversation to arrive and was recognizing its approach. "You're going to leave in 5 days," Leah said. "That's the arrangement," Sarah said. "Right." Leah looked at the ceiling, then back, "and the arrangement is the relevant thing. It's what we agreed to." "People agree to things," Leah said, "and then they acquire more information, and sometimes the information changes what they would have agreed to if they'd had it at the start." She paused. "That's not a breach of contract. That's just being a person with a functioning brain." Sarah looked at her hands. "The things you were saying were the truest things available to you at the time," Leah continued. "You needed specific things. He was offering them. You agreed." She paused. "But that was 25 days ago, and you are not the same person you were 25 days ago. And more importantly, the situation is not the same situation. It's the same contract," Sarah said. Leah looked at her with the accuracy of 28 years. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Not what the contract says. What do you want?" The question was simple, and the answer arrived immediately from the place below the part of her that made assessments and managed situations, and kept herself arranged. And it was so clear and so complete that she sat with it for a moment just to make sure it was real, that it was a genuine answer, rather than a feeling she'd mistake for one. "I want 5 more days to not be the end," she said. Leah waited. "I want," she continued carefully, "the specific thing that has been happening in that library and that kitchen and that apartment to be allowed to keep happening." She paused. "I want to find out what it is." She looked at her sister. "I don't know what that requires." "It requires telling him," Leah said, in the direct way of someone who had never confused knowing a thing and saying a thing as the same step. "He may not want the same thing," Sarah said. This was a real consideration, not a deflection. The arrangement had been his design and his terms, and she didn't know, with certainty, that the past 25 days had moved him in the direction they'd moved her. She'd read things in his expression and his attention, and the way the library had started to feel like a place they inhabited rather than shared. But reading and knowing were different. Leah looked at her with the expression that had preceded every important piece of sister advice in their shared history, the look that arrived just before the thing that was true. "He arranged for me to be here," she said, "in a building where he lives, where you're living. He arranged for the person who matters most to you to be nearby." She paused. "People who are managing a transaction don't do that. People who are managing a transaction pay what they agreed to pay and maintain the appropriate distance." Sarah sat with this. "He's not managing a transaction anymore," Leah said quietly. "I don't think he has been for a while." She tilted her head. "The question is whether you're going to make him say it first, or whether you're going to be the person who says the true thing to—" Sarah looked at her sister, then at the window, then back. "You're very annoying," she said. "I know," Leah said, with the contentment of someone who had always found being right more satisfying than being comfortable. Sarah went to the library that evening. Damon was already there, which had stopped being a surprise across 25 days, and had started being something she noticed in the positive rather than the neutral, the way you notice the presence of something that made a room better. He looked up when she came in. The expression that had started as unreadable on day 1 had become, across 25 days, something she could navigate with increasing confidence. She sat across from him. She put her book on the table and didn't open it. He waited. 5 days, she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked back with the full weight of his attention, which was not small. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it without managing the answer toward what you think the situation requires. Just the true thing." He was very still, Has the past 25 days been what you expected, she said, when you designed the arrangement? A long pause, the kind that was doing real work rather than creating effect. No, he said finally, not in any way that mattered. She held his gaze. What did it turn out to be instead? Another pause. This one longer. This one carrying the specific weight of a person deciding to put something down that they'd been carrying in a particular way for a long time. Something I didn't have a category for, he said, carefully. Something that started as a requirement and became a preference, and then became something that I don't have adequate language for, because the language I have was developed for situations I've experienced before, and this isn't one of them. His voice held its usual evenness, but underneath it, there was something uneven, something she'd never heard in it before, the sound of honesty that cost something. She paused. He paused. You are not what I brought here for 1 month. He looked at her with the expression that was his most unmanaged. You have become something I don't know how to file under a 30-day arrangement. The library was very quiet. She thought about 5 days. She thought about the decision that had been forming like weather, pressure building toward rain. Then I think, she said, that we need to reconsider the 30 days. Day 27, and she called the lawyer herself. Not because Damon had suggested it, not as a response to anything external. She called because she'd made a decision, and she was the kind of person who followed decisions with action rather than sitting inside them waiting for something to move. The lawyer, who was Damon's and professional and had handled stranger arrangements than this one, confirmed what she'd suspected, that the terms of the annulment were contingent on both parties, that mutual agreement to restructure the arrangement was within the original contract's provisions, and that yes, legally, there were options. She went to Damon with this information the same morning, finding him in the kitchen where their honest conversations seemed to gather the way significant conversations gathered in kitchens, the ordinary setting making the extraordinary things easier to say. I spoke with your lawyer, she said. He looked at her from the window where he was standing with his coffee. There are provisions for restructuring. He waited with the stillness she'd spent 27 days learning to read. She said, I'm not asking you to change what this is overnight. I'm not asking for something that sounds different from what it was and turns out to be the same thing. She looked at him steadily. I'm asking if you want to find out what this actually is, given the space to find out. He was quiet for long enough that she counted the seconds without meaning to. Then, what changed? I stopped managing the question, she said. She met his eyes. I've been managing a great many questions for a very long time, and I got very good at it, and it's a useful skill in most situations. She paused. This stopped being most situations a while ago. Something moved through his expression. She watched it arrive and settle. He put his coffee down on the counter and turned fully toward her, which was the physical version of the same thing, stopping managing the angle. What you're describing, he said carefully, is trusting something that didn't begin with trust. It began with necessity, she said, which is where most of the real things begin. She paused. I'm not asking you to forget how it started. I'm asking if you're willing to let it be something that started in one place and arrived somewhere else. He crossed the kitchen. He'd never moved toward her with intention before, not without the context of an event or a social navigation that provided cover for the movement. He moved toward her now without cover, just the intention itself, and stopped close enough that the space between them was a choice rather than a default. Sarah, he said, her name and his voice with the specific quality it had started to have, not information but something more like acknowledgement, as if the name itself meant something additional. She looked up at him with the steadiness that had never been performed, and that had started, she realized, as a mechanism and had become something else, something that was simply who she was in proximity to this specific person. I want, he said, to find out what this is." He said it the way he said true things, with the full weight of having thought about it and arrived at it, rather than reaching for what the moment requested. I have wanted that for longer than I made the question available to be asked. His expression was entirely unmanaged, the first time she'd seen it fully, without any layer of the careful composure he'd built around himself. What I should tell you is that I don't know how this works. I have managed my life and my obligations for a very long time, and I know how to do that well. He paused. "This is not management." "Good," she said. "I've had enough of management." He did something she hadn't seen him do before. He reached out and took her hand, both of them still standing in the morning kitchen in the ordinary light, and he held it the way of someone making a decision rather than executing one, the full weight of it present in the gesture. She held his hand back. 3 days remained on the contract. They felt, for the first time, like something to move toward rather than count down from. The shift in the apartment across those final days was the shift that happened when something that had been contained was allowed to be its actual size. Not dramatic, not declarative, simply real in the way that real things were real, present in the ordinary moments that accumulated into the shape of a life. Breakfast became the three of them, Damon and Sarah and Leah, the table loud with Leah's specific enthusiasm for everything, which was a quality that had survived her illness more intact than the illness had expected, and Damon's careful responses that grew, across the 3 days, less careful, more actual. She watched him learn to be in a family-shaped thing, the adjustments of someone who had spent a great deal of time alone, learning the grammar of not being alone. She watched Leah decide she approved with the specific decisiveness of someone for whom approval was not given lightly, but, once given, was absolute. The nights in the library continued. But they were different nights now. The chairs were closer. The silences were the same quality but contained more, held more of what was between them, the way a container fills differently once the question of what it holds has been answered. He told her things about the span of what he'd seen and the specific strangeness of living long enough that history stopped being abstract and became personal, the way you might speak of a city you'd visited, becoming the city you'd known before the buildings changed. He told her about the Voss family obligations and the specific shape of a life structured around rules established before anyone currently living had been alive to participate in making them. He told her about the loneliness that was different from being alone. That was the specific condition of being present in the world without being seen by it, of moving through rooms full of people who saw the category and not the thing. She told him things back. About her father, who had been kind in an impractical way that hadn't survived practical circumstances, and what she'd learned from watching someone she loved fail to it. About Leah before the diagnosis, the specific version of her sister who had believed without limit that the world would accommodate whatever she wanted to do with it, and how that belief had been tested and had survived, modified, but essentially intact. About the 6 months she'd described as not believing things would get better, and what that had felt like from the inside, the particular gray quality of a life you'd stopped expecting to improve. He listened to everything with the attention that was his particular quality, the attention of someone for whom listening was not preparation for speaking, but the actual purpose. On day 29, she said, "When I came here, I told myself I wouldn't confuse proximity for connection." He looked at her from across the library. A pause. "And now? Now I think I was wrong about what proximity was," she said. "I thought it was physical closeness creating the illusion of knowing someone." She met his eyes. "But proximity is just the condition that makes knowing someone possible. It's not the thing itself. The thing itself is different." "What is the thing itself?" he said. She thought about it properly rather than answering. "The thing itself is," she said, choosing to see someone. Not the category, not the situation, not what they represent, the specific person they are. She paused. That's a choice. Proximity just means you have enough information to make it. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was his most honest and that she now knew well enough to read fully. Then, quietly, "You saw me." She held his gaze. Yes, the library held them in its silence. Outside the city did its ordinary eternal things. Tomorrow was day 30. Day 30 arrived with the specific quality of mornings that know they are significant. The light came through the windows in the same way it always came through the windows. The city outside moved in its usual patterns. The apartment had the same sounds and the same air and the same sourceless warmth that expensive buildings maintained regardless of season. Everything was the same, and the day itself was entirely different. Sarah woke early. She lay in the bed she'd been sleeping in for 30 days and looked at the ceiling that had never developed a water stain and thought about the day ahead with the specific attention she brought to days that required it. The annulment papers were on the desk in the sitting room. They'd been there for 3 days, prepared in advance by the efficient machinery of Damon's legal arrangements. 2 signatures required. The conclusion of one thing. She got up. She dressed. She went to the kitchen and made coffee the way she'd learned to make it in this kitchen across 30 days, and she stood at the window and looked at the city and let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing inside. 30 days. It was an arbitrary number, established for reasons external to both of them, calibrated to an obligation and a family tradition and an old law about what constituted sufficient time for an arrangement to be considered fulfilled. She'd accepted it because it had been offered, and she'd needed what was attached to it. And now it was day 30, and she was standing in the kitchen with her coffee, and she knew, with the clarity that had arrived on day 25 and had only grown more specific since, that 30 days was both too long and not nearly long enough. Damon came in. She heard him before she saw him, which was the normal order now, her own awareness of him having expanded across 30 days into something more comprehensive than she'd authorized. He came to stand beside her at the window, and she handed him her coffee. Not hers. The one she'd made for him, because she'd started doing that at some point, without noting the exact day. He took it. They stood at the window. The city moved below in the ordinary morning way. "The papers are on the desk," she said. He looked out the window. "Yes, I looked at them this morning," she said. She kept her voice level the way she kept everything level, from practice rather than absence of feeling. "I thought about signing them." He was very still. "The thing is," she continued, "that they require me to attest that the arrangement has concluded." She paused. "And I don't think it has." She looked at him rather than the city. "I think it changed into something that isn't the arrangement anymore. Sometime between day 1 and day 30, it became something that doesn't have a conclusion because it's not the kind of thing that concludes." She met his eyes. "And I don't want to sign a document that says otherwise." He turned from the window to face her fully. The morning light fell on him in the specific way of morning light in kitchens, the most honest light there was, and his expression was entirely unmanaged, showing all the layers at once, the careful centuries of composure, and underneath it the things she'd been finding across 30 days, the specific and irreducible reality of who he was. He reached past her and picked something up from the counter. She realized he'd had the annulment papers with him, had brought them into the kitchen, had been carrying them in the specific way of someone who had already decided something and was arriving at the moment of the decision. She watched him. He held the papers in both hands, looking at them for one moment with the full weight of everything they represented. Then, with a quiet and complete deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of how he did every significant thing, he tore them in half. Then in half again. Then he put the pieces on the counter in a small pile that contained the conclusion he'd decided not to conclude. She looked at the pieces. Then, at him, something moved through her chest, large and warm and without a precise name. The specific feeling of a thing you'd hoped for arriving exactly as you'd hoped. He said, "I need to tell you something." His voice was the same low even register, but with the specific quality underneath it she'd first heard on day 29, the unevenness of honesty that had cost something to arrive at. He said, "I designed this arrangement with the intention of keeping appropriate distance. I was very clear with myself about what it was and what it wasn't. The conditions were practical, and the outcome was defined." She waited, he said, "and then you came in and sat across from me in the library and read your book, and were entirely yourself, and I found that appropriate distance was not something I was able to maintain with any real conviction past approximately day 7. He looked at her with the expression that was his most unguarded, the one she'd been learning for 30 days, and would be learning for a long time after. He said, "I have been alive a very long time. Long enough that most things have become familiar, and familiarity has become the primary quality of existence." He paused. "You are not you are the specific and particular thing you are, and I have found that I want to keep finding that out." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not tearing up a contract. I'm telling you that the contract was never the relevant thing, once I understood what the relevant thing was." The kitchen was warm and bright, and the city moved below the window in its ordinary direction. She thought about a woman 11 days from eviction standing in a kitchen with yesterday's clothes on, holding a letter written in ink that pressed into paper like a claim. She thought about the specific arithmetic of desperation and how it sometimes led. By routes you couldn't have designed, somewhere you couldn't have imagined. She thought. Update it. She thought. She closed the distance between them, the space that had been carefully maintained and then gradually reduced, and that was now, on day 30 in the morning kitchen, simply a choice being made with the full information she'd accumulated across 30 days of paying the attention she'd always paid. His hands found her face with the careful tenderness of someone handling something they'd already decided was irreplaceable. She put her hands over his and held them there, his cool, specific hands and her warm ones together, morning light on both of them, the small pile of torn paper on the counter behind her, and she thought that this was the kind of beginning that looked like an ending if you only saw the surface of it. It was not an ending. She tilted her face up toward his, and the distance closed entirely, and he kissed her the way he did everything that mattered, with his full attention and nothing withheld, and she kissed him back with 30 days of accumulated truth, and outside the city moved in its ordinary morning way, entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing happening in a kitchen above it. The arrangement had concluded. Something else had begun. The weeks after day 30 had a different quality from the weeks before. The container had been removed, and what remained was what had always been inside it, larger than the container had suggested, more complex, more alive. She stayed. Not in the way of someone who had nowhere else to go. The arrangement had given her somewhere else to go. A new apartment funded, a life rebuilt, the practical things restored. She stayed because leaving was the thing that no longer made sense, that required her to look away from what was true. And she'd spent enough of her life looking away from true things because they were inconvenient that she'd developed a principled objection to the practice. Leah stayed for 3 more weeks, her recovery progressing with the specificity of someone who approached getting better the same way she approached everything, with an enthusiasm that made it personal. She and Damon developed something that looked from the outside like bickering, and was from the inside, Sarah could see, the beginning of a genuine fondness. The kind that happened between people who were too honest with each other for social comfort, but found the honesty refreshing once they'd adjusted. He's very old, Leah said one morning, in the way of someone stating a verified fact. Extremely, Sarah said. And the not human thing. You're okay with that? Sarah considered the question properly. I've thought about the not human thing, and what I find is that who he is across 30 days of actual proximity is more legible to me than any category. She paused. The not human thing is real and true, and it means specific practical things I'm still learning about. But it doesn't change the thing I know, which is who he is. Leah looked at her with the accuracy she'd always had. And who is he? Someone who listens, Sarah said. Someone who tells the truth, even when the truth costs something. Someone who notices what matters to the people near him and acts on what he notices without making the noticing into a performance. She paused. Someone who is genuinely lonely in a way that has nothing to do with being alone, and who is, I think, less lonely now. She looked at her, someone who tore up a piece of paper on day 30 in a way that was the truest thing I'd ever seen anyone do. Leah absorbed this. Then, with the simplicity of someone for whom the conclusion was already obvious, you love him. The word arrived in the room with the weight of true things, the specific gravity of something that had been true before it was named. Sarah sat, let it be as large as it was. Yes, she said. I think I do. Leah nodded once with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. Good, she said. He looks at you like someone who has been looking for something for a very long time and has recently found it and is still slightly astonished that he found it. She thought about this late, thought about being looked at that way, and what it meant after months of being reduced to statistics and debts and failures, after years of managing everything alone in the specific efficiency of someone who'd never been given the option of being otherwise. Being looked at like something found. She went to Damon that evening, not to the library, to the observatory room on the upper floor, where he sometimes stood and looked at the city at night in the specific contemplative way that she'd come to read as his version of needing to be inside his own thoughts. She came and stood beside him, and he made space for her presence without moving to create it, the natural adjustment of someone who had learned her proximity as a welcome thing. I need to tell you something, she said. He turned slightly toward her. I love you, she said. In the direct register of someone saying a true thing, because it was true, and because clarity was always better than its alternative. Not because of what you provided. Not because the 30 days were easier than the year before them. She looked at him steadily. Because of who you are in a library at 2 a.m. Because of a card written for my sister. Because of the way you listen. Because of a piece of paper you tore up in a kitchen. Because the conclusion it represented was the wrong conclusion. He looked at her with the expression that she had a word for now, that she'd had a word for since the kitchen, the expression of someone who had found something they'd stopped expecting to find and was still slightly astonished by the finding. He said, I have been careful, across a very long life, about the things I allowed myself to need. He said it with the full evenness of his voice, which no longer read to her as composure, but as characteristic. Simply the way he sounded, the way he thought. I was careful because need creates vulnerability, and vulnerability across the specific span of my experience has consequences that take a long time to recover from. He looked at her. I have not been careful about you. She waited. I need you to know that, he said. That what I said on day 30 was not the momentum of a significant moment. I have thought about it with the deliberateness I bring to things that matter, and the conclusion is the same. He paused. He moved toward her in the way he'd moved toward her in the kitchen on day 27, with intention rather than cover. You are the specific and particular thing you are, and I find that I love that thing. He said it, plainly. The way she'd said it. The full weight of it. No performance. I love you, Sarah, with the entirety of what that means for someone of my age and nature. which is considerable. She thought about the water stain on her old ceiling, and the eviction notice, and the envelopes she'd stopped opening, and the specific gray quality of a life she'd stopped expecting to improve. She thought about a letter pressed into cream paper arriving on a Wednesday. She thought, this is what updating looks like. She put her hand against his chest, over the place where his heart moved in its slow and ancient rhythm, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood at the window looking at the city below, which was ordinary and eternal and entirely ignorant of what was happening above it. The shape of the life that followed was unlike anything she'd planned in the planning stages of her previous life, which had involved specific and modest ambitions about stability and sufficiency and keeping her sister alive and solvent. Those ambitions had been achieved and exceeded and had turned out to be the floor rather than the ceiling, the starting point of something she hadn't had the imagination for, when imagination was a luxury she couldn't afford. She worked. Not because she needed to, the resources were no longer a question, but because work was how she thought, how she located herself in the world, the structure that made the rest of it navigable. She went back to the field she'd been building a career in before the bad year had interrupted it, research and consulting, the kind of work that required exactly the quality of attention she'd always had, and that rewarded it without apology. Damon's world opened to her in layers. The Voss family with its age and its obligations, and the specific social complexity of people who had been in proximity to extraordinary things long enough to have complicated relationships with them. She came to understand Lucian across several more dinners, the specific architecture of a man who had built himself around function, because everything else had been taken from him long enough ago that function had become identity. She found, in the architecture, something she recognized. She found others, too. People adjacent to Damon's world who had their own versions of the complexity, the various ways of being in proximity to something old and strange and finding accommodation with it. Some had found peace. Some had not. The difference, she noted, was usually not the accommodation itself, but the terms on which it had been made, whether it had been chosen or simply defaulted into. She'd chosen. Every time she looked at the pile of torn paper she'd kept, for reasons she didn't analyze too carefully, on the desk in the sitting room, she remembered that she'd chosen. Leah came back to the city permanently once her recovery was complete. She got a job and an apartment, and the kind of life that looked from the outside like starting over and felt from the inside like continuing, which was the better version of the two. She came to dinner weekly, which had become the thing that happened on Thursdays, and she brought a growing collection of opinions about everything, including Damon, who had developed the specific affection of someone who had been disarmed by a person's refusal to be managed, and found it, ultimately, admirable. "You're less careful than you were," Leah told him one Thursday over dinner. He considered this with the deliberateness he brought to everything. "Yes," he said, "by design." "Good," Leah said. "Careful people are exhausting over the long term." She looked at Sarah. "Tell him he's allowed to be funny." "He's allowed to be funny," Sarah said. "He's already funny," Damon said. "He just makes you find it yourself." Leah pointed at him. "That was funny," she said. More of that. The apartment had become, across the months, something that felt less like the luxury it technically was, and more like the specific thing a home was. The place that held the shape of your life and knew you by the way you moved through it. She had her books in the library, integrated now with his across decades and centuries of acquisition, hers new-spined and his variously worn. She had her corner of the kitchen window where she stood in the mornings. She had the specific silences she'd learned in this apartment, each one different, each one familiar. She learned about his life, the breadth of it, the particular strangeness of a history that was personal rather than academic. He told her things slowly, in the way he did everything that mattered, with deliberateness and attention to what she was receiving and how. He told her about cities he'd known before their current shapes, about people he'd been adjacent to, whose names had become the kind of names that appeared in the books on his shelves. He told her about loss, and about the specific endurance required of a life that outlasted most of what it loved. He didn't tell it as tragedy, which she noted and respected. He told it as information, the way of someone who had processed a great deal and arrived at understanding without requiring her to help carry the weight. She told him about her father in more detail, the full version rather than the abbreviated one, the specific sadness of watching someone you loved fail to adapt and knowing there was nothing you could do to adapt for them. She told him about the job she'd had before the bad year, what she'd been building, what the interruption had cost beyond the practical things. She told him about the 6 months of gray, with more detail than she'd given Leah, the specific texture of a period when you'd stopped believing in the forward direction of your own life. He listened to all of it, received it with the full attention that was his particular and irreplaceable quality. And what she found, giving those pieces to someone who listened the way he listened, was that they changed shape in the telling, became things that had happened rather than things that defined. The difference between past tense and present tense, which had always been a grammatical distinction, revealed itself as a lived one. One evening, deep in the winter months, she was in the library with a book she wasn't reading, and he was across from her in the chair that had become his chair, and she thought about day 5, the first night in the library, 2 people in 2 chairs not talking, and how much the silence in the same room between the same chairs had accumulated across all the evenings since. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked up. "The arrangement," she said, "when you designed it, the 1-month structure. Did you think," she paused, choosing the question precisely, "did you believe it was going to be what you said it was? 30 days, conclusion, no contact." He held her gaze, a long pause. "No," he said finally, "not entirely." He looked at the book in his lap without seeing it. "I told myself that I was being practical, that the family obligation required what it required, and I was managing it efficiently, and the terms were clear and appropriate." He looked at her. "But I chose very carefully." He paused. "Someone who researched your specific qualities was looking for something more than a contractual convenience." He said it with the honesty that had cost him something on day 27, and cost him something now, different and smaller, because honesty became cheaper with practice. "I was not entirely honest with myself about what I was looking for." She looked at him. "And when you found it?" "I tore up the paper," he said simply. He looked at her with the expression that still made her aware of how it had developed from the unreadable into the fully legible across a specific period of days, the expression of someone for whom the sight of her face was a specific and personal pleasure. The winter evening held them in its particular quality. Outside, the city was doing its cold and lit and ordinary things. Inside the library, the silence had the warmth and weight of all the evenings accumulated inside it, all the true things said and received, all the distances crossed, and the careful spaces set down. She thought about 30 days as a beginning. She thought, what an astonishing thing to have fallen into. Spring arrived, and with it the particular quality of things beginning again. The light returning in increments that were noticeable only in accumulation. The city outside the window growing brighter by degrees, until one morning she stood with her coffee and found the whole city gold. There was a conversation she'd been circling for weeks. Not avoiding it, she'd given herself credit for having moved past avoidance as a primary strategy for difficult things. Circling it the way you circled something large that required the right angle of approach. It had to do with time. She sat with it one morning alone in the library, the good morning light doing what it did to the books and the shelves and the worn places on the armchairs. And she let herself think about it with the full attention she usually deployed on things she'd decided to understand, rather than manage. Damon was old. She knew this in the abstract, and she'd known it in increasingly specific ways across the months. The references and the memories, and the particular quality of someone for whom history was personal. He would continue to be old, or rather to be what he was, across a span that made her own lifespan look like an afternoon relative to a year. She would live the normal length of a human life, which was not short in absolute terms, and was very short in relative ones. She didn't know how she felt about this yet. That was the honest answer. She hadn't resolved it into either peace or grief. She'd been sitting with the complexity of it, the specific tangle of loving someone whose timeline was entirely different from yours, the particular form of loss built into the structure before anything else had even happened. He found her there, which was not unusual, and he came in and sat in his chair and looked at her with the reading face quality that became, after a moment, the recognition that she was in the middle of something. She said, "I've been thinking about time." He waited. "About the gap in ours," she said, "the specific arithmetic of it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to solve it. I don't think it has a solution. I'm telling you it's something I'm sitting with." A long pause. Then, carefully, "What do you want to know about it?" "I want to know," she said, "how you think about it. From where you are. With your specific experience of she gestured at the breadth of it, the centuries, the things she didn't have adequate language for." He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was answering properly rather than quickly. When he spoke it was with the evenness that held something more alive underneath it. "I think about it," he said, "the way I think about most true things. Which is that it's real, and the reality of it doesn't change what else is real." He met her eyes. "What is real is that you are here. What is real is that this specific period, however it measures against any other, contains what it contains." He paused. "I stopped, a very long time ago, measuring things against other things. It makes the thing in front of you smaller without making the other things larger." She held this. "What I know," he continued, "is that I will remember." He said it plainly, without drama, in the register of a fact being stated. "Whatever comes after, I will carry what this is the way I carry everything that has mattered." He looked at her with the expression she knew. He said, "And what this is has mattered more than I had terms for before you provided them." She thought about that for a long time, about being carried by something that would continue. The thought was both sad and not sad, containing its own contradiction the way true things often did. She said, "I don't want to spend the time I have thinking about the time I don't have." He said, "No." She said, "I want to spend it actually here." He said, "Then, be here." The simplicity of it was the point. She looked at him across the library and felt the full weight of the specific and irreplaceable thing they'd built from 30 days, and a torn piece of paper, and two people being honest with each other across a series of evenings in two chairs. She felt it the way she felt true things, in the place below the part of her that managed and assessed and kept itself arranged, the place that simply knew. She crossed the library and sat on the arm of his chair, which was something she'd started doing sometime in the winter, and which had become the thing she did when the distance of two chairs was more than the moment required. He shifted to accommodate her in the practiced way of someone who had adapted to this as the natural configuration, his arm coming around her with the ease that was only possible on the other side of 30 days of other things. She leaned against him. He was cool and still and present in the specific way that was entirely his. Outside the library, the spring morning was doing its gold and ordinary things. Below the window, the city moved in its eternal directions. In the room that held all their evenings, the silence was warm and full and known. She thought about a Tuesday letter, and a Wednesday night, and a car, and a contract, and a morning kitchen, and the specific sound of paper tearing into a conclusion that was actually a beginning. She thought about all the things that had looked like endings and had turned out to be the first day of something that didn't have a name yet. She thought, this is what updated looks like. This specifically, this room, and this chair, and this arm, and this particular and irreplaceable person beside her in the morning light. She said, I want to learn the old language, the one from the books in the lower shelves. He looked at her with the expression, the one she'd learned from unreadable to fully fluent across a remarkable and specific period of days, the one that was his most honest face, the most him. He said, it takes a very long time to learn properly. Good, she said. She settled against him more fully. She looked at the books and the light and the spring morning. She felt him settle too, the particular quality of someone who has found the place they were moving toward and arrived. Good, she said again. Quieter. We have the time. And they did. Not the same quantity. Not the same kind. But the time they had, which was the only kind that was real, which was the only kind that had ever been relevant. She stayed in the chair beside him, and the morning moved through the room, and the city moved below, and the spring did what springs did, patient and incremental and indifferent to anything except the forward direction. And two people who had found each other inside a 30-day container and had torn up the conclusion, sat together in a library that held all their evenings and began the next thing, which was simply more. More mornings and more evenings and more silences with all their different qualities and more true things said in the register of people who had learned that truth between them was the best language available and the one they'd keep speaking. More of this, which was, it turned out, entirely enough.